I was sitting at the heavy wooden dinner table, staring at my plate of cold mashed potatoes, when Jason suddenly raised his crystal glass. The light from the chandelier caught the liquid inside, making it sparkle. "To my big promotion, Senior Operations Manager," he said, grinning broadly. He paused for dramatic effect, then looked straight at me with a sharp, mocking glint in his eyes. "Some people just aren't built for success, I guess." Everyone at the table laughed, the sound echoing off the high ceilings. I felt the sting hit me instantly. It was sharp, familiar, and deeply humiliating. My stepmother leaned in, her smile matching Jason's pride. I didn't say a single word. I just took a slow sip of my water and looked back down at my plate. What they didn't know, what Jason didn't have the slightest clue about, was that by 10 o'clock tomorrow morning, he would be officially reporting to me. The secret was sitting in my inbox, safe and silent, while he bragged about a title that was already beneath mine. I let the laughter continue, knowing that the silence I held was far more powerful than any toast he could ever make in this dining room. Jason did not stop there. He never stops when he feels he has a captive audience to impress. He leaned back in his chair, looking like the king of the world, and continued his victory speech. "I mean, it is a tough world out there, and not everyone can handle real pressure," he added casually, tossing a glance toward my father. I could feel my stepmom watching my every move, her eyes waiting for me to snap or show even a tiny bit of jealousy. She wanted a reaction so they could label me as the bitter, unsuccessful sister who couldn't handle her brother's shine. I kept my face perfectly neutral, almost like a stone mask. Inside, though, something very important shifted. It wasn't the hot burn of anger that I used to feel years ago. Instead, it was a cold, hard sense of certainty. I wasn't waiting for revenge. I was simply waiting for the clock to turn. The reality of the situation was already decided, and no amount of his loud talking could change the organizational chart that was being finalized at that very moment. I watched him boast, thinking about how quickly his world was about to change. That night, after the dishes were cleared and the house was finally quiet, I sat on my small couch and opened my laptop. I needed to see it one more time to make sure it was real. I stared at the official email again. "Congratulations, Paige Hayes, Director of Operations." The words looked solid and bold on the screen. It was the same department where Jason worked. It was the same chain of command he was so proud to be climbing. Jason's name was right there in the new digital org chart, clearly listed in a box directly under mine. I let out a long, slow breath that I felt like I had been holding for years. He really had no idea what was coming for him in the morning. He thought he had reached the top of the mountain, but he didn't realize I was already standing on the peak above him. I closed the laptop, the glow of the screen fading into the darkness of my living room. For the first time in a long time, I slept peacefully, knowing that the truth didn't need to be shouted to be real. This wasn't just about tonight's dinner. Jason had been acting exactly like this for years, loud, overly confident, and always absolutely sure he was 10 steps ahead of me. He treated life like a race where I was stuck in the slow lane. And for a long time, I let him think that. I never corrected his assumptions or bragged about my accomplishments. While he spent his time talking loudly in meetings and trying to be the center of attention, I put my head down and worked. While he was showing off his expensive watch and talking about his potential, I was building something real. Strong relationships with the executives and a record of results that couldn't be ignored. He saw my silence as a lack of ambition. He saw my quiet nature as a sign that I was failing. But leadership isn't about who speaks the loudest at the dinner table. It is about who provides the most value when the lights are off and the pressure is on. I had spent years preparing for this transition, while he had spent years preparing for a celebration he hadn't fully earned yet. The next morning, the sun was barely over the horizon when I walked into the office. I made sure to arrive early, before the rush of the morning commute filled the hallways with noise. There was no big announcement on the lobby screens yet. There were no balloons or banners waiting for me. To anyone walking by, I was just another dedicated employee starting her day, which is exactly how I preferred it for now. I walked past the empty cubicles and the silent break room, feeling the weight of the new responsibility on my shoulders. I didn't need a parade to feel successful. I went into my new office, the one with the glass walls that overlooked the entire operations floor, and set my bag down. From here, I could see everything. I could see the desks where the work happened and the conference rooms where the big decisions were made. I took a seat in the leather chair and pulled up my first task list. The transition was beginning, and I wanted to be ready before the first person punched their time card for the day. As the office began to fill up, I saw Jason across the floor. He was walking with a swagger that you could see from a mile away. He was shaking hands with everyone he passed, laughing loudly, and accepting congratulations. Fastest promotion in the history of the department, I heard him say to a group of junior analysts. He was basking in the glow of their impressed faces, feeding off the attention like it was oxygen. He looked so sure of himself, so convinced that he was the hero of the story. I just watched him quietly from behind my glass wall, knowing how incomplete that picture really was. He was celebrating a title that gave him power over a small group, but he didn't realize he was now answerable to me. It was like watching someone celebrate winning a local race while being completely unaware that they had just been entered into a much larger, global competition. I didn't feel smug watching him. I felt a strange sense of pity. He was so focused on the image of success that he had completely missed the reality of it. I turned my attention away from the window and pulled up Jason's official performance file on my computer. I needed to be fair and objective, regardless of how he treated me at dinner. As I read through his records, I saw that he wasn't a bad worker. Actually, he was quite good at hitting his targets. But as I dug deeper into the data, the cracks started to show. He cut corners on safety protocols to save time. He ignored certain administrative processes because he thought they were beneath him. Most importantly, he relied heavily on his confidence and charisma to cover up gaps in his actual technical knowledge. He was a salesman in an operations role. I leaned back in my chair, tapping a pen against my chin. This was going to be an interesting challenge. As his new boss, it was my job to fix those gaps, but I knew his ego would make it nearly impossible for him to listen. I had to decide how to handle a subordinate who thought he was my superior in every way that mattered to him. At one point during the busy morning, Jason walked past my new office. He glanced in, his eyes scanning the room as if he were looking for the person who belonged there. Our eyes met for a brief second through the glass. He didn't recognize what my presence in that specific office meant. He probably thought I was just in there to drop off some paperwork or help with the move for the real, new director. He gave me a quick, dismissive nod, the kind you give to a secretary or a low-level clerk, and kept walking toward the break room to tell another story about his promotion. I almost smiled at the irony. He was so blinded by his own sense of importance that he couldn't see the very obvious change right in front of his face. He didn't even wonder why I was sitting behind the desk instead of in my old cubicle. It was the perfect example of his biggest flaw. He never looked at the details if they didn't serve his own ego. He was walking toward a cliff, and he was too busy checking his reflection in the glass to notice. The HR department had told me that my promotion wouldn't be officially announced via the company-wide email until the end of the week. That gave me 5 more days. 5 days of watching him act like he was already the one in charge of the entire floor. Most people would find that frustrating, but I didn't mind at all. If anything, it made things much clearer for me. It allowed me to see how he behaved when he thought no one of higher authority was watching. I saw how he spoke to the interns when he thought it didn't matter. I saw how he handled minor crises when he thought he could take all the credit. These 5 days were like a secret scouting mission. I was learning more about his leadership style or lack thereof than I ever could have through official meetings. By the time Friday arrived, I wouldn't just be his boss. I would be an expert on all the mistakes he was currently making. I sat back and took notes, letting him perform his solo show for an audience of one. On Tuesday, we had a departmental strategy meeting. I wasn't leading it yet, so I sat quietly in the back of the room with my notebook. Jason was sitting near the front, leaning forward and dominating the conversation as usual. At one point, a junior manager suggested a new workflow strategy that I had actually reviewed and approved weeks ago in my previous role. Jason laughed and shut it down immediately. "That won't work in the real world," he said with a condescending smirk. "It looks good on paper, but it lacks the grit we need for senior operations." The junior manager looked down at his notes, silenced and embarrassed. I sat there, my pulse steady, watching the interaction. No one corrected him. No one pointed out that the strategy was actually very sound. They were all too intimidated by his loud voice and his senior title to speak up. I realized then that Jason wasn't just arrogant. He was creating a culture where people were afraid to innovate. That was a problem I would have to solve very quickly once I took the reins. I decided I couldn't let that specific moment pass entirely without a small test. I didn't expose him or mention my new title, but I spoke up from the back of the room. My voice was calm and measured. Jason, can you explain exactly why that strategy won't work? I asked. The room went silent as everyone turned to look at me. Jason hesitated just for a tiny second. I saw a flash of surprise in his eyes that I had dared to question him in public. Then he recovered his usual smugness. It's complicated, Paige. You'd need to understand the high-level operations to see the flaws. It's just too technical for this discussion. He smiled at the others, expecting them to join in on the dismissal. But I didn't look away. I'm interested in the technical details, I replied. Please explain. He stumbled through a vague answer that made no sense to anyone who actually understood the data. He was still confident, but he was very clearly wrong. I just nodded and went back to my notes, having confirmed exactly what I suspected. He was a hollow leader. Over the next few days, I continued to pay very close attention to the pattern of his behavior. It was the same thing over and over again. He interrupted people mid-sentence if he thought his point was more important. He dismissed ideas that didn't come from him or his small circle of friends. Worst of all, I saw him take credit for a report that an intern had spent all night finishing. I realized something deeply uncomfortable during those observations. This wasn't new behavior. He had been doing this for years, both at home and at work. I had just never been in a position where I had the actual authority to stop it before. I had always been the quiet sister or the junior colleague who had to just take it. But the world was changing. I wasn't just observing a jerk anymore. I was observing a liability to the company's success. I started drafting a new set of protocols for the department, rules that focused on collaboration and proper credit. Jason was going to hate every single one of them, and that was exactly the point. On Wednesday afternoon, one of the senior executives, a man named Mr. Vance, pulled me aside into a private corner of the office. Jason has a lot of potential, Paige, he said, looking out at the floor where Jason was currently holding court near the coffee machine. He has the energy and the drive, but he needs direction. He needs someone to ground him. I nodded slowly, listening to the executive's perspective. He wasn't wrong about the energy, but he was missing the toxic part of it. I agree, Mr. Vance, I said. He needs a specific kind of direction. I didn't say anything more, and Mr. Vance smiled, clearly happy that I was on board. I already knew exactly what kind of direction I was going to provide. It wasn't going to be a lecture or a punishment. It was going to be a reality check. True leadership isn't about crushing someone's spirit. It's about channeling their energy into something productive instead of destructive. I spent the rest of the day planning how to turn Jason from a loud talker into a real worker, if that was even possible. That evening, we had another family dinner at my father's house. My stepmother had made a special roast to celebrate Jason's first week as a senior manager. The bragging was even worse than the first night. Once I'm truly running things, this place will finally start to improve, Jason said, waving a fork around for emphasis. The current leadership is too soft. They don't have the stomach for the hard calls. I looked at him from across the table, my expression unreadable. I felt the weight of my phone in my pocket, the phone that contained the final draft of the announcement email. Let's see how it goes, Jason, I replied simply. He laughed, a loud, barking sound that filled the room. Spoken like someone who stays in the background, Paige. Don't worry, maybe one day you'll get a tiny promotion too. My stepmother chuckled and patted his hand. I just smiled and took a bite of the roast. It was fine. Let them have their moment of pretend glory. Tomorrow was Friday, and this soft leadership he was talking about was about to become his direct boss. On Thursday, Jason made a very big call at work. It was a high-stakes decision regarding a shipment for our largest client. He didn't wait for approval from the director's office, likely because he thought the office was still empty. It was a risky move that could have saved a few $1,000s but risked $1 million partnership. I saw the order hit the system and realized immediately how dangerous it was. I could have let it fail. I could have let him fall on his face to prove a point. But that's not what a good director does. I stepped in quietly behind the scenes, made 3 phone calls, and adjusted the logistics to cover his risk before the client ever saw the mistake. He never even knew how close he came to a total disaster. He walked around the rest of the day thinking he was a genius for taking a shortcut. I just watched from my glass office, realizing that my first task as his boss would be to teach him the difference between being brave and being reckless. Finally, Friday morning arrived. It was the day of the weekly leadership meeting where all the managers and executives gathered in the main boardroom. I walked in early and took a seat at the very head of the long mahogany table. Jason was already there, sitting in the middle, looking relaxed and confident. He was chatting with Blake, another manager, and didn't even look up when I sat down. He probably thought I was just there to take minutes for the meeting or act as an assistant. He was checking his watch, clearly impatient for the real meeting to start so he could show off his weekly results. The room filled up with the other managers, and the air was thick with the smell of coffee and expensive cologne. The CEO, a stern woman who valued results over talk, walked in and stood at the end of the table. The room went silent instantly. I sat perfectly still, my hands folded on top of my leather-bound notebook. This was the moment the years of work and silence were finally going to pay off. The CEO didn't waste any time with small talk. She looked around the room, her gaze stopping briefly on Jason before moving to me. "Before we get into the weekly numbers, I have a very important announcement," she said. Her voice was strong and carried through the room. "As most of you know, we have been looking for a new director of operations to lead this department into the next quarter. After a long search and a review of consistent performance, I'd like to introduce our new director, Paige Hayes." The silence that followed was absolute. You could have heard a pin drop on the carpeted floor. I didn't look at Jason right away. I didn't need to feel his eyes on me to know what he was feeling. I kept my gaze fixed on the CEO and gave a professional nod of thanks. "Thank you, ma'am. I'm ready to get to work," I said. My voice was steady and clear, exactly as it had been in every meeting for the last 5 years. I felt the shock in the room like a physical wave, but I stayed grounded in my seat at the head of the table. I finally allowed myself to glance over at Jason. He was staring at me like he didn't recognize reality anymore. His mouth was slightly open, and the color had completely drained from his face. It was as if his entire world had just been turned upside down and shaken. And then I could see the moment it all clicked for him. Every dismissive comment he had made at dinner. Every joke about me, not being built for success. Every time he had ignored me in the hallways. All of it landed on him at once like a ton of bricks. He looked at the seat I was sitting in, the head of the table, and then back at his own seat in the middle. The hierarchy was no longer a dream or a brag. It was a cold, hard fact. He looked like he wanted to say something, to protest or object, but there was nothing to say. The CEO had spoken, the emails were being sent, and the quiet sister was now the one who determined his salary, his projects, and his future at the company. I didn't pause to let the awkwardness linger. A good leader doesn't let a moment of shock turn into a moment of weakness. "Let's begin the meeting," I said. I didn't acknowledge the family connection or the look on his face. I simply opened my notebook and started through the first item on the agenda. My voice was steady, professional, and completely focused on the tasks at hand. It was as if nothing had changed, even though everything had. I went through the quarterly projections, the new safety protocols, and the logistical updates I had drafted. I spoke with authority because I had the knowledge to back it up. I didn't need to shout or dominate the room. The data spoke for itself. I watched as the other managers slowly recovered from their surprise and started taking notes. They recognized the shift in power, and they respected it because they knew I had earned it. Jason, however, remained frozen, his pen hovering over his paper, but never actually touching it. He was still trying to process the fact that his world had just changed forever. After the meeting ended and the room cleared out, Jason cornered me in the hallway. He didn't have his usual swagger. He looked small, his shoulders hunched, and his eyes darting around to see if anyone was watching us. "You knew?" he asked, his voice a low, raspy whisper. I held his gaze with a level of intensity that made him flinch. "Yes, Jason. I knew," I said. That was all I said. I didn't explain myself, I didn't apologize, and I didn't brag. I didn't need to. The fact that I had known while he was mocking me at dinner made the sting even worse for him, and I let that silence do the work. He looked like he wanted to get angry, to scream about how unfair it was, but he realized that doing so would only prove the CEO's point about his lack of maturity. He was trapped by his own previous behavior. He turned and walked away without another word, his footsteps heavy on the tile floor. I watched him go, then turned and walked back into my glass office to start my real work. Things changed very quickly at the office after that. Jason got much quieter. The loud stories in the break room stopped. The swagger was replaced by a cautious, almost nervous walk. He was careful with his words in meetings, and he stopped interrupting people. He realized that the soft leadership he had mocked was now watching his every move. More importantly, people started coming to me instead of him. Not because I demanded their attention or used my title to bully them, but because they saw that I actually had the answers. They saw that I protected them and valued their input. I earned their respect through my actions, while Jason had only ever demanded it through his words. The atmosphere on the operations floor improved almost overnight. The junior managers felt heard, the interns felt valued, and the work started moving faster and more accurately than it ever had under the old, loud regime. I didn't have to be a tyrant to be a boss. I just had to be competent and fair. To Jason's credit, he didn't give up or quit. He could have walked away, but he stayed. He started working harder than I had ever seen him work before. He began listening more in meetings, actually taking notes when other people spoke. He still struggled with his ego sometimes. You could see him biting his tongue when he wanted to make a sarcastic comment, but the effort was there. It was different now. The ego was still present, but it was being managed by the reality of his situation. He was learning that he couldn't just talk his way into success. He had to actually produce. I watched his progress with a critical eye. I gave him the hard projects, the ones that required attention to detail, instead of just a big personality. I wanted to see if he could actually handle the real pressure he had bragged about at dinner. Slowly, very slowly, he started to prove that maybe he was built for success after all, just not the kind he used to think it was. One night, several weeks after the promotion, Jason came to my office after the sun had gone down. Most of the other employees had already gone home, and the office was quiet. He stood in the doorway for a long time before knocking softly on the glass. "I was wrong, Paige," he said when I looked up. It wasn't a dramatic, cinematic apology with music in the background. It was just a simple statement of fact. "I was arrogant, and I treated you like you were nothing. I didn't see the work you were doing because I was too busy looking at myself." He looked tired, but for the first time, he looked honest. He wasn't performing for an audience. He was just talking to his sister and his boss. I put down my pen and looked at him. I could see the genuine regret in his eyes. It was the first time in our entire lives that he had ever admitted a mistake to me without being forced to by our parents. I didn't make the moment emotional or use it to lecture him. A leader knows when to be firm and when to be professional. "This is about the work, Jason," I told him, my voice calm but steady. "I don't care about the dinner table comments anymore. I care about the results on this floor. Focus on being a good manager, and the respect will follow." I didn't give him a hug or tell him everything was fine. I gave him expectations. You have talent, but you need to use it to lift others up, not push them down. If you can do that, you have a future here. If you can't, your title won't save you. He nodded slowly, accepting the terms. No lecture was needed, and no revenge was taken. Just clear expectations and a path forward. He turned to leave, but he stopped at the door. "Thanks, Paige," he said quietly. I just nodded and went back to my laptop. The shift was complete, and the balance had finally been restored. At the next family dinner, things were much quieter. My stepmother still tried to make a big deal out of Jason's work, but he didn't join in. When someone asked him how the department was doing, he didn't brag about his own achievements. He just looked across the table at me and said, "Paige runs the department. We're doing some good things." There were no jokes, no digs, and no mocking laughter. For the first time, my father looked at me with a sense of real pride that wasn't filtered through Jason's shadow. I realized then that the truth didn't need me to defend it. As I closed another successful deal on my laptop later that night, I thought back to the day Jason had bragged about his promotion. He thought he was ending my career by moving past me. He didn't realize he was actually introducing me to the best part of it. I had earned my place, I had earned my respect, and for once, that was more than enough.